Hello and welcome to Antinatalism this week. Before we start about the stories and articles and videos of this week, just a reminder that Nimrod's European tour, the second European tour of antinatalism activism, has started. He's in Slovenia for this weekend and then moves to Italy, Milano for Monday and Tuesday, and then spends the rest of the week in Paris, France, and then moves to United Kingdom, London for the next weekend. Also, Amanda Sukenik had organized a contest challenging people to respond to their new book Antinatalism, Extinction and the End of Procreative Self-Corruption. The submissions for that contest now are closed and the winners are going to be announced on 1st of July in the 90th episode of the Exploring Antinatalism podcast. So looking forward to what those submissions are, who the winners are. The prize is going to be free copy of the book Antinatalism, Extinction and the End of Procreative Self-Corruption. Michael, the space science guy, has made a video about sentient artificial intelligence. And if you think this is some kind of science fiction and we don't have to worry about this in reality, then this video would be an eye-opener for you. Michael starts by pointing out that a lot of people are worried about AI safety in the sense that they are worried about threats of AI to us. But what about AI itself? What if it becomes sentient and then we have to bring these artificially sentient beings into our moral considerations? He gives some good reasons to worry about this thing. One, there could be a greater number of sentient artificially intelligent beings compared to biological ones. Two, they could be exploited for their labor without any consideration for their own well-being. Three, we won't really know when AI actually becomes sentient, given that we don't actually know when biological beings achieve sentience. It is usually a period, it is a range through which they achieve sentience. And four, once they are here, there is no going back. These are not just theoretical musings. Michael shows an example of BrainAware, which is a biocomputing device which uses actual human brain cells, neurons. This is a being or a device created by a company called Final Spark. On the website, they say, at Final Spark, we use living cells, specifically human neurons, to perform computations. We strive to store data and perform logic operations using neurons as circuits. Michael points out that to make this work, they use dopamine, which is the same compound that drives some of the functions in our brains. So this is very interesting, but at the same time, very worrisome from an ethical standpoint. From an antinatalist point of view, it would be better if these beings are not created in the first place. Thomas Metzinger is a philosopher specializing in topics like cognitive science, neurophilosophy, and philosophy of mind. He was interviewed on a channel called Mathiv Galata, where they discussed about many different topics, but one of them was conscious AI. He made a few interesting points there. One, suffering-free biological life is not an option that we can have, but we might create suffering-free conscious experience in intelligent machines. Two, we have a deep existence bias in the sense that we are survival machines and we have a strong craving for existence. So we'll continue our existence even in the face of severe suffering. But the conscious AI might not necessarily have this sort of bias, and it might be capable of switching itself off if it does not see any reason to continue. Given these 2 points, Thomas asks the question that should we rather make a way for evolution of such systems and pass on the baton? My interpretation of pass on the baton here is that we as biological beings should let ourselves go extinct, and our future progeny would be these suffering-free intelligent machines who would not have any cognitive biases like existence bias, etc. But Thomas is not so optimistic. In fact, he had written a paper in 2021 asking for pausing of creation of conscious AI until 2050 until we are sure of the consequences. But there are people who have no problem creating sentient AI for entertainment purposes, even if it means that those AI beings could suffer. So he assumes that somebody is going to do that, and he thinks that's a bad news. He points out some of the problems that we have about suffering and the references or lack of references that we have about suffering. He says biological evolution is not something to be glorified. We are impressed by the beauty of different shapes and forms and life and plants, and it's just unfathomable the creativity of evolution, but it also has created an ocean of suffering and confusion in a region of physical universe where nothing like this existed before. One also has to see this, and I think evolution has created much more negative phenomenology than positive phenomenology in animals. So this is the only architecture that we have of evolution, and with that, if we are hasty to create artificially conscious beings who would have super processing and replicating powers, then it would be risky in at least two ways. We don't understand the mechanism of suffering on a deeper level in the beings that we already have. So even if we decide to create conscious AI in an ethical way, the problem of grounding those ethics is not solved. For example, it is very hard to define what is a good state of consciousness. And two, there could be many actors who would not have that empathy towards the suffering of these beings. Thomas says there are people who are okay to impose suffering on these intelligent machines because we are doing it on children and on other animals anyway. Finally, Thomas says that if we can guarantee that we can make suffering-free conscious AI, then we may as well do it, but we don't have any reference for such a state through our past experience. On a YouTube channel called Pessimistic Society, 6 criticisms of Benatar from Antinatalism by Julio Cabrera are getting published. This one is the first of those 6 parts, and the second one is going to be published on 24th of June. Julio Cabrera is an antinatalist himself and a profound thinker, and he has also written several books on the wrongness of having children. He shares some of the central ideas of antinatalism with Benatar. Ideas like 1. Life has suffering in it, and 2. Procreation is ethically problematic. The differences are on the view of abortion and suicide. According to Benatar, abortion follows from the antinatalist arguments, whereas suicide does not. And in case of Cabrera, he says that he has exactly the opposite viewpoint on these two topics. But Julio's criticism of Benatar is more about specific arguments that Benatar makes for antinatalism. Cabrera's first objection is the analytical method used by Benatar. Cabrera says that this method might not be enough to address the problems of life like meaning, suffering, death, and so on. He takes an example of Emile Cioran. Cabrera says that Cioran's books were certainly on antinatalism, although he never used the term antinatalism, and also his writings were not analytic philosophy. Analytic philosophy is the way of putting arguments directly and precisely in prose and evaluating them with rigor using formal logic and mathematics. Cabrera says that other methods involving aphorisms, metaphors, figures of speech, and literary styles can be effective for subjects like life, death, meaning, absurdity, and existence. The extreme precision and rigor of analytic philosophy can cause a loss of intensity of these subjects. The topics that we are trying to analyze here, like life, meaning, death, etc., are ambiguous and imprecise, whereas the analytical method to address these topics leaves no room for such tolerances. According to Cabrera, analytic philosophers think that those who do not use precision and rigor for the topics like these are incapable of rigorous analysis. But on the other hand, in analytic philosophy, the human experiences from subjective point of view are not considered. They only consider objective descriptions, and the subjective experiences are put under the basket of psychology. Cabrera gives Benatar's analysis as an example of this. Benatar says that people's own assessments of their own lives are not reliable because they are driven by psychological biases like optimism bias, Pollyanna principle, and so on. Cabrera points out that some continental philosophers have claimed that the phenomenon of lived cannot be reduced to such objective elements. So people's own experiences of living their own lives should not be dismissed so easily. To demonstrate this contradiction, Cabrera takes an example from one of Thomas Nagel's quotes where he says, "It is often remarked that nothing we do now will matter in a million years. But if that is true, then by the same token, nothing that will be the case in a million years matters now." Cabrera says that this is a perfect mathematical symmetry, but humans experience these two facts quite differently. The fact that nothing we do now will matter in a million years causes some level of anxiety in us. And that's because we strive to create something in future. It is on this fact that we base our hopes for the future. But what actually happens after a million years does not really affect us in the same way. So Cabrera's point is that things might look in a certain way objectively, but we might be experiencing them in a different way subjectively. He says the symmetry pointed out by Nagel is purely logical, but it totally ignores its existential dimension. Similarly, take two facts. 1, life is bad, and 2, life is not worth living. So from the fact that life is bad, it is rational to say that life is not worth living. But Cabrera says that humans don't necessarily go by this rational thinking. He says that life is recognized as bad, and yet people want, despite everything, to live. The second objection by Cabrera is a little more technical. There are two ways of understanding existing beings. Let's take an example of a triangle, of this particular triangle. We can say that this triangle exists in the sense that it occupies some shape in a certain way on the screen or on paper. So we are defining this triangle in terms of its interactions with the universe in which it exists as a result of its existence. These are called entities. But we can also think about essence of a triangle, which is a closed shape with three sides. Now you might say that that is just a concept, but concepts also exist. This is what philosophers refer to as being. Cabrera says that when Benatar talks about quality of human lives, he is doing calculations of goods and bads in their lives. These are generated through their existence in the universe. That is, Benatar only considers humans as entities. But an optimist can claim that most people manage to utilize goods in their life, at least to an extent of not regretting being born. Benatar does not consider the deeper essence of being of the human. Schopenhauer called that being as an all-time striving will. So if we consider this essential part of the being, then we don't have to be dependent on the calculations of goods and bads of existence within the universe. It's a bit like saying a triangle has three sides, and this was true even before I brought this particular triangle into existence. Similarly, the human's being in and of itself is of a negative value. Cabrera's third objection is qualitative in the sense that Benatar's approach, he says, is too cold and calculative. Benatar compares goods and bads and harms and benefits of life in an economic manner like we do while buying commodities. But Cabrera says humans don't live their lives like this. They assign variable weights to experiences and feelings, which makes measurements of things like suffering and well-being extremely difficult. For example, it is logical to say that humiliation is preferable to death because we can recover from being humiliated, but we cannot recover from being dead. And yet, many humans prefer to die rather than being humiliated. So a mere calculation of goods, bads, harms and benefits does not capture the whole essence of human lives. The fourth and final objection in this first part of the series has more to do with the style of writing philosophy. Analytic philosophers are direct and clear in what they want to say. In other traditions of philosophies like continental ones, aphorisms, figures of speech, symbolisms are used to do a few things. One, to convey a lot of information very briefly. Two, convey feelings and the force behind them. And three, some of these sentences are left purposefully abstract for the reader to participate in their interpretation. So this style of philosophy is more lively and nearer to the problems that it is either trying to solve or expose the reader to. Cabrera criticizes Benatar on all of these aspects of analytic philosophy. Lawrence made a video responding to a tweet by Jordan Peterson about a study on happiness of people who don't have or want to have children. And I must say, Lawrence destroyed Peterson there. And also Elon Musk on the way, as Elon also had replied to Jordan's tweet. So well done, Lawrence, in killing two birds together. The main theme of almost all pronatalists is that they see children as a means to their own ends, and they don't see any problem with that. And that's exactly where Lawrence attacks Peterson. It's a short but nice and concise video, and I hope it catches Peterson's attention. There was a video in Chinese language, Antinatalism and the Philosophy of Life, David Benatar, the Buddha, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche. Looking at the translation of the transcript, it looks like it was an overview of antinatalism and its connection to religions like Hinduism and Buddhism, and some details about antinatalist philosophers and their works. There was an article on Vox.com, Can We Be Actually Normal About Birth Rates? The article is actually about declining birth rates and raises some problems with the current solutions to solve them. The author Kelsey Piper has 3 children and plans to have 3 more. She recognizes that using children as a means to an end is ethically problematic. She also recognizes that government policies to increase or decrease birth rates is a risky approach. So she proposes an approach of promoting having children on a more cultural level rather than as a policy. But there is one particular paragraph that I want to address. While there are extremists on the internet calling for voluntary human extinction to surrender the planet to worthier animals, and extremists on the internet calling for an end to feminism and a ban on birth control, the majority of people in the United States have kids. They love their kids and prioritize their kids. Many of them would have chosen to have more kids if structural factors like housing and education permitted it. 1. This is a false dichotomy. Voluntary human extinction is just one of the many strands of antinatalism, and there are many others, and those others could also be called as extremists. 2. Just calling an idea extremist is a lazy way to reject it. There were many ideas in the past which were described as extremist in comparison to the times in which they were brought in, but are normally held views now. For example, Veganism is gaining normality and the edge of extremism is coming off as years go by. Complete abolition of chattel slavery was thought of as an extremist viewpoint at the time when chattel slavery was norm. Thirdly, the swift change in focus from the world to the US, as if the US is the only country that matters. This is a style of writing I have seen primarily in the US media, where they conveniently adjust the scope to suit their own point. Anyway, that's not actually related to antinatalism, so I'll just leave it there. Forbes.com had an article, The Rise in DINKs, Sinks, DINKWADs, KIPPERs, and more. From the title itself, we know that this is not an antinatalist article, but rather a child-free article. But still, it is on Forbes site, which is a great thing in and of itself. And secondly, it highlights the reason why people are living child-free. Taking numbers from a survey of US Americans by MarketWatch, which we also had covered in one of the previous episodes of Antinatalism this week, the article mentions the top reasons for not having children are financial freedom, the day-to-day flexibility of not having children, and being unable to financially support a kid right now. And of the financial reasons were high cost of living, concerns about a recession, being unable to buy a home, high consumer debt, and too much student loan debt. So it is evident that low birth rates are not because of antinatalism. But the question is, as antinatalists, should we celebrate the consequences of low birth rates anyway? Moreover, if this continues for a certain point in time, then eventually populations would start declining. And from an antinatalist point of view, is this a good thing or a bad thing? For that, we have to go from the US to Japan, where Asagi Hozumi published an article, What Population Decline Means to Antinatalism. Asagi is an antinatalist activist in Japan, and he identifies as painist. Painism is an idea proposed by Richard Ryder, who also coined the term speciesism. In his book Painism, A Modern Morality, Richard explains, Painism is a term I coined in 1990 to describe the theory that moral value is based upon individuals' experience of pain and that pain itself is the only evil. The pain referred here is all kinds of pains, physical pains, mental pains, and so on, so it is interchangeable with the word suffering. Similarly, anyone who can experience pain is called a painient being. Now, this article tries to explore two questions about declining populations. What does it mean from the perspective of painism, and what does it mean from the perspective of antinatalism? In general utilitarian calculations, we think of total amount of suffering or happiness or average amount of suffering, etc. While doing this, we are aggregating suffering of many individuals together. In his book, Richard Ryder says, this must be wrong. Around each individual is the boundary of its own consciousness, and so such aggregations of pains and pleasures across individuals make no sense. For each individual, only his or her pain is real. And if our focus is on reducing suffering, then on this view, it matters whose suffering we are talking about and not so much of how many sufferers there are. Richard says the morally significant measure of pain in a group of painients is the maximum felt by any one of them. I conclude therefore that the moral priority is to try to reduce the pain of the maximum sufferer in each case. And that's where the question of population decline comes up. On this view, the maximum sufferer continues to suffer the maximum degree of pain in comparison to rest of the population, and whether that rest of the population is big or small does not really matter. In fact, if the pain of the maximum sufferer is going to be increased even further by reduction of the population, then on painism view, that decline in population could be seen as a bad thing. And this situation is not very hard to imagine. Consider a scenario where due to declining population, a certain type of doctors who could treat a certain painful disease become unavailable in the area where the maximum sufferer is present and is suffering from this particular disease. As a result, the pain of the maximum sufferer is increased even further. And so on the view of painism, this is actually a bad thing. But Asagi says things are not usually that straightforward. So he proposes a case of probability. He puts up a mathematical example to demonstrate that the probability of at least one person experiencing extremely painful life increases as number of people increase. And this is not very counterintuitive. Imagine a flipping coin experiment where we flip a coin, and if it is heads, then a person with less suffering is created. If the result is tails, then a person with more suffering is created. The probability of continuously getting heads keeps on reducing as we keep on flipping the coin again and again. Eventually, I will get tails no matter how lucky I am. Similarly, the larger the population, the chance of creating someone whose pain exceeds the maximum pain suffered by anybody in the existing population increases. Here, Asagi is not considering the technological advancements that have gone hand in hand with the increasing populations so far. Therefore, he concludes that painistically, population declines might be a good thing at least on the probabilistic calculations. But what about antinatalism? Is declining population a good thing or a bad thing for antinatalism? On a superficial level, if antinatalism does not want sentient beings to be created, then the reduction in population of those beings as a result of lower birth rates is a good thing. But Asaki tries to fit antinatalism with painism as proposed by Richard Ryder. In the original book, Richard had proposed a list of 42 rules to explain the framework of painism, some of which you can see on the screen. Asaki says that when we create a painient being, that is somebody who can feel pain, we are also creating a consciousness. Now, this is true at least for higher animals, so we'll not consider nuanced problems about beings who are not conscious but can feel pain. Through this consciousness, we perceive things around us, and through this perception, we construct a world around us. In this world, there is only one painient being, and that being is by definition the maximum sufferer in that particular world. So if we don't create that being in the first place, we have prevented the creation of maximum sufferer in that world. That way, antinatalism becomes the zeroth rule of painism, which Asaki Hozumi calls Hosmian painism as opposed to Ryderian painism. So here are some salient points. From painist point of view, the declining populations are neither good nor bad, as the focus is on the degree of pain of the maximum sufferer. However, declining populations can be said as good from painist point of view because that reduces the probability of creation of yet another maximum sufferer. Declining populations are not good enough from an antinatalist point of view if the ideal population is 0. So any non-zero number means suffering beings are getting created. Asaki combines painism and antinatalism, and he says that prevention of creation of new painient beings should be considered as the most basic rule of painism, which is also the case for antinatalism, and therefore declining populations can be said to be good for antinatalism. In other words, declining populations are good for those who would have existed had the populations not been declining. And this, I think, can also be said as a person-affecting view of antinatalism in the light of population decline. Another aspect from antinatalism activism's point of view is that the lower the population, the lesser are the people that we have to convince for antinatalism.